Among the sealed plantation records of Mecklenburg County, Virginia, one ledger entry stands apart from all others. Written in hurried script across 3 separate pages dated March 1848, it documents something that defied even the brutal logic of slavery itself. A woman listed as property who had given birth to 11 children across 27 years, each one fathered by a different generation of the same family. The county clerk, who discovered these records in 1847, tasked with settling the estate, reportedly refused to complete his work and resigned his position without explanation. What he found in those pages, in the careful notations of births and sales, in the margins filled with justifications and erasers, revealed a deliberate horrors of the institution. The family in question had kept meticulous records as if documenting an experiment. Before we continue with the story of what happened on the Strathmore plantation, I need to ask you to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss stories like this. And please leave a comment telling us what state or city you're watching from. We love knowing where our audience is listening. What those records revealed would force an entire county to confront a question they had never wanted to ask. What happens when the machinery of slavery is applied not with casual cruelty, but with calculated intent across generations? The Strathmore plantation occupied 1,100 acres along the Roanoke River in a region where Virginia's rolling hills flattened into tobacco country. By 1821, when our story begins, Mecklenburg County had become one of the state's most productive tobacco-growing regions, its economy entirely dependent on enslaved labor. The Strathmore family, headed then by Colonel Edmund Strathmore, represented the county's established gentry, neither among the wealthiest planters nor the poorest. They owned 43 enslaved people, maintained a modest but well-appointed main house, and were known locally for their adherence to what they called scientific management of their holdings. Edmund Strathmore had inherited the property from his father in 1815, along with considerable debts from the tobacco price collapses that followed the War of 1812. A veteran of that conflict, Edmund had returned home with ideas about efficiency and record-keeping gleaned from his time as a quartermaster. He applied military precision to plantation management. Detailed ledgers tracked every aspect of production, from pounds of tobacco cured to the birth dates and lineages of every enslaved person. His wife, Catherine, had died in 1820, giving birth to their only surviving child, a son named Lawrence, leaving Edmund to raise the boy alone. Among the enslaved people Edmund inherited was a girl named Harriet, born on the plantation in 1808. The records describe her as mulatto, likely quarter, suggesting mixed ancestry. By 1821, at 13 years old, she worked in the main house as a domestic servant, a position that removed her from the brutal field labor that claimed so many lives but placed her in proximity to the family in ways that would prove significant. The household in those years consisted of Edmund, the widow, our colonel in his early 40s, young Lawrence, barely 8 years old, and a small staff that managed the main house. Edmund's brother Thomas lived in a separate residence on the property with his own family, managing much of the day-to-day plantation operations. The social fabric of Mecklenburg County in this period was defined by an elaborate code of honor among the planter class, one that simultaneously demanded public rectitude while permitting private transgressions that remained deliberately unacknowledged. The county seat, Byton, lay 7 miles distant, far enough that the plantations operated as self-contained worlds, their internal affairs rarely subject to outside scrutiny. Local clergy visited occasionally, and neighboring planters socialized during harvest festivals and Christmas gatherings, but the daily realities of plantation life remained largely invisible to any meaningful oversight. The legal framework of Virginia slavery granted enslavers almost unlimited authority over those they held in bondage, with interference in plantation management viewed as a violation of property rights. It was into this world isolated, hierarchical, and governed by the absolute authority of white men over black bodies that the events began to unfold. What made the Strathmore case distinct was not the occurrence of sexual exploitation, which was tragically commonplace, but the systematization of it across generations, documented with the same clinical precision Edmund applied to his tobacco yields and livestock breeding. The first notation appears in Edmund Strathmore's personal ledger in January 1822. Unlike the plantation's main record books, which tracked births, deaths, and sales in simple columns, this private journal contained more detailed entries written in Edmund's precise hand. Harriet delivered of a daughter, healthy, light-skinned, named Ruth, to be raised in the house. The entry included no father's name, a deliberate omission in a ledger that meticulously recorded the parentage of every other child born on the plantation for breeding and valuation purposes. Harriet was 14 years old. The household dynamics shifted subtly after Ruth's birth. Harriet remained in the main house, now with an infant daughter who slept in a small room off the kitchen. Edmund's sister-in-law, Martha, who occasionally visited from Thomas's residence, later wrote in a letter to relatives in Richmond that she found the arrangement peculiar, but not improper. As Edmund shows Christian charity in keeping the girl from field work, despite her condition, the language was careful, coded, the same willful blindness that characterized how the planter class discussed such matters. Over the next 5 years, 3 more children appeared in Edmund's ledgers. Sarah in 1824, Mary in 1826, and a son named Thomas in 1828, all listed as born to Harriet, all described as bright mulatto, all with no father recorded. Each birth followed the same pattern. Harriet would disappear from the house for several days, returning with a newborn who would be accommodated somehow in the already cramped servants' quarters. The other enslaved people on the plantation understood what these omissions meant, but their knowledge existed in a space beyond official acknowledgement, beyond the protection of any law or custom that might intervene. Young Lawrence Strathmore was growing up during these years, transitioning from child to adolescent. Edmund, acting as both father and plantation master, educated his son in the ways of managing human property. They walked the fields together, Edmund explaining the complexities of tobacco cultivation, the calculation of labor inputs, the maintenance of discipline. Lawrence learned to ride, to shoot, to command. And he learned through daily observation the unspoken rules that governed the relationship between enslaved women and the men who held power over them. The first hint of what would become a pattern across generations appeared in Edmund's ledger in 1835. Lawrence was now 22, recently returned from a brief stint at the College of William and Mary, which he had left after 2 years without completing a degree. That spring, the ledger recorded, Harriet delivered of a son, Marcus Healthy, father, Lawrence Strathmore. Unlike the previous entries, this one included paternity, and the notation seemed almost proud, as if acknowledging a tradition being passed down. Harriet was 27 years old. She had been bearing children since she was 14, and now the pattern had shifted to the next generation. What the ledger didn't record was whether she had any choice in the matter, whether she experienced these events as violations or had found some way to survive by accepting them, whether the children she bore were wanted or simply inevitable. The documents preserved facts, but erased humanity. The inclusion of Lawrence's name represented something more calculated than the typical silence around such matters. Edmund had chosen to document his son's actions, to create a record that linked the generations explicitly. It suggested intention, a delivery that went beyond individual transgression into something more systematic. By 1840, the Strathmore plantation had evolved into what Edmund considered a model of efficient management. His ledgers revealed increasing profitability, not from expanded acreage or improved tobacco varieties, but from what he termed natural increase, the birth of enslaved children who added to his property value. Harriet's children, now ranging from infant markers to 18-year-old Ruth, represented significant assets in these calculations. But the human cost of this efficiency was becoming harder to conceal, even within the closed world of the plantation. Harriet had borne 9 children by 1840, 4 to Edmund in her teenage years, and 5 more to Lawrence between 1835 and 1840. The physical toll was evident to everyone who saw her. A traveling Methodist preacher who visited Strathmore in 1839, invited to conduct services for the enslaved population, noted in his diary that one of the house servants appeared, worn beyond her years, moving with difficulty, yet tending to children who seemed to span an impossible age range for one mother. The preacher's observation highlighted something the official records obscured. Harriet was 32 years old and had spent nearly 20 years in continuous childbearing. The children themselves occupied an ambiguous space in plantation hierarchy, clearly mixed race, obviously related to the Strathmore men, yet still enslaved. Ruth, the eldest, worked alongside her mother in the main house. The younger children helped in various capacities, tending chickens, carrying water, running errands between the buildings. Edmund's health began to decline in early 1841. At 61, he suffered from respiratory problems, likely exacerbated by decades of tobacco dust exposure. As his condition worsened, he spent increasing time in his study, obsessively organizing his papers and ledgers. His brother Thomas, who had managed much of the daily plantation operations for years, assumed more visible authority. But the disposition of property, including the enslaved people, remained Edmund's decision. Lawrence, now 28, had married a woman named Elizabeth Mercer from a neighboring county in 1839. She moved into the Strathmore main house, and the presence of a white mistress altered household dynamics significantly. Elizabeth certainly noticed Harriet and her children, particularly Marcus, who at 6 years old bore an unmistakable resemblance to her husband. The historical record contains no direct evidence of Elizabeth's thoughts or reactions, but letters from her sister suggest she found plantation life challenging to Christian sensibilities and spent much time visiting relatives. During Edmund's final illness in late 1841, he made arrangements that revealed the full extent of his calculations. His will, written with the assistance of a baton attorney, disposed of his property in meticulous detail. The enslaved people were divided among family members, with most going to Lawrence as primary heir, but specific provisions addressed Harriet and her children. They were to remain together, assigned to Lawrence with the notation that these individuals represent valuable property, whose separation would diminish their collective worth. Edmund Strathmore died in December 1841, leaving Lawrence as master of the plantation. The transition of power was smooth. Lawrence had been groomed for this role his entire life. He continued his father's management practices, maintained the detailed ledgers, and preserved the systematic documentation that Edmund had established, and he continued the pattern his father had begun with Harriet. The 1840s brought significant changes to Virginia's economic landscape. Tobacco prices fluctuated wildly, and many Mecklenburg County planters began diversifying into wheat cultivation or selling enslaved people to the expanding cotton plantations of the Deep South. The Strathmore plantation, under Lawrence's management, pursued a different strategy. Intensive exploitation of its existing labor force coupled with the natural increase that Edmund had emphasized. Harriet bore 3 more children between 1842 and 1845, all documented as fathered by Lawrence. The births came with increasing difficulty. At 34, then 36, then 37, her body showed the cumulative damage of continuous pregnancy and childbearing. A letter from Thomas Strathmore to a business associate in Richmond, dated May 1845, mentioned in passing that my nephew works his people hard, perhaps too hard, but the yields remain strong. The phrase works his people hard carried multiple meanings in the context of slavery, and Thomas's choice of words suggested awareness of something beyond typical labor exploitation. But whatever concerns he might have harbored remained private. The Strathmore family maintained its reputation as respectable planters, regular church attendees, and proper citizens of the county. Lawrence's son, Edmund, was born to Elizabeth in 1843, named for his grandfather. The boy grew up in the main house, attended to by enslaved servants, including some of Harriet's older daughters. The Jewessician was stark, the white child, heir to the plantation, being dressed and fed by his own half-sisters, enslaved and unacknowledged. This was not unusual in plantation households, but the Strathmore situation carried an additional layer of complexity given the deliberate documented nature of the relationships. By 1847, Harriet had borne 12 children across 26 years. The oldest, Ruth, was now 25, and had herself given birth to 2 children, adding to the plantation's enslaved population. The younger children ranged down to the infant born in 1845. Harriet herself was 39, aged beyond her years, increasingly confined to lighter duties as her health deteriorated. It was during this period that cracks began to appear in the careful documentation Edmund had established. Lawrence's ledger entries became more sporadic, with gaps appearing in the usually meticulous records. An entry from March 1847 reads, simply, Harriet unwell, attended by Thomas's wife, Martha. Recovery uncertain. No details, no diagnosis, just an acknowledgement that something had shifted. The spring of 1847 brought another development that would prove significant. Young Edmund Strathmore, now 4 years old, showed an early precocity that delighted his father. Lawrence began including the boy in tours of the plantation, much as Edmund Sr. had done with Lawrence decades earlier. The child was learning the family business, being shaped into the next generation of masters. During one such tour in April 1847, documented in Lawrence's diary, Edmund asked his father about the children who worked around the main house. "Why do they all look like each other?" the boy asked, his child's eye noticing what adults had learned to unsee. Lawrence's recorded response was vague. "They are family from the same mother. That is how things work here." The exchange revealed the normalization of the situation. Young Edmund was being taught to see enslaved people as property, their relationships and origins irrelevant beyond their utility. But something in that interaction seems to have troubled Lawrence, judging by entries in the following weeks. He wrote more frequently about proper management, about maintaining order, about the responsibilities of our position. The language suggested a man attempting to justify something to frame it within acceptable moral categories. He increased the frequency of religious services for the enslaved population, bringing in preachers to emphasize obedience and submission as Christian virtues. The summer of 1847 was oppressively hot, even by Virginia standards. Tobacco cultivation suffered and several enslaved people collapsed from heat stroke in the fields. Lawrence became increasingly preoccupied with financial concerns. Crop failures meant decreased revenue, and he had borrowed against future harvests to finance expansions. The pressures of plantation management weighed heavily, and his private writings from this period show a man struggling to maintain control. Harriet's health had not improved since the spring. She was now largely confined to her small room, able to perform only minimal duties. Martha Strathmore, Thomas's wife, attended to her occasionally, providing herbal remedies and what passed for medical care in that context. A letter from Martha to her sister in Petersburg dated July 1847 provided rare insight into the situation. "I tend to a woman who has suffered beyond measure, though none speak of it directly. She bears it with dignity that shames those responsible, yet I am powerless to intervene in matters not my own." The letter was as close as anyone came to acknowledging the reality of Harriet's situation, but Martha, like all women in the planter class, existed within constraints that limited her agency. She could offer private charity, but not public challenge. The system protected itself through layers of complicity and silence. In August 1847, an incident occurred that disrupted the plantation's careful order. Marcus, Harriet's son by Lawrence, now 12 years old, was caught attempting to leave the plantation. He had taken food and a blanket, heading north along a route that suggested he had learned something about the underground railroad networks that existed even in Virginia. He was apprehended within hours, returned to the plantation, and confined to a locked shed for 3 days. The usual punishment for such an escape attempt would have been severe whipping, public humiliation, and possible sale. But Lawrence instead chose a different response. He documented the incident meticulously in his ledger, noted Marcus's age and parentage, and then did nothing. The boy was returned to his duties without physical punishment, an anomaly that suggested Lawrence was calculating something beyond immediate discipline. That same month, Elizabeth Strathmore left the plantation, taking young Edmund with her to stay with her parents in Halifax County. The official explanation was that she sought relief from the summer heat and wanted to visit family, but the timing immediately following Marcus's escape attempt suggested other motives. A letter she wrote to her sister discovered years later provided context. "I can no longer remain in a house where sins of the fathers visit children who bear their faces yet are treated as cattle. My husband speaks of duty and management, but I see only willful cruelty wrapped in ledger columns." Elizabeth would not return to Strathmore Plantation. She and Lawrence would remain married but separated. Young Edmund spending most of his time with his mother's family. This arrangement, while unusual, was not unprecedented in Virginia society. Marriages existed on paper, while couples lived apart, maintaining appearances while acknowledging private incompatibilities. The events of October 1847 would finally expose what the Strathmore family had carefully documented, but never publicly acknowledged. A traveling county clerk named Samuel Pritchard arrived at the plantation to conduct a routine assessment of property values for tax purposes. This was standard practice, requiring examination of land, buildings, equipment, and enslaved people. What made this assessment different was Pritchard's thoroughness. He had a reputation for meticulous accuracy and insisted on reviewing all relevant documentation. Pritchard was 43 years old, a native of Petersburg, who had built his career on reputation for honesty in a profession often corrupted by favoritism and bribery. He arrived at Strathmore on October 12th, carrying the leather satchel that contained his assessment forms and measurement tools. Lawrence greeted him cordially, offering refreshment and a room in the main house for the duration of his work. It was standard hospitality, and Lawrence showed no concern about the examination. Why would he? The records were meticulous, the property well maintained, everything documented with the precision his father had instilled. The first day passed routinely. Pritchard measured fields, examined tobacco stores, assessed the condition of buildings and equipment. He spoke with Thomas Strathmore about crop yields and with the overseer about livestock. By evening, he had completed the physical inspection and requested access to the plantation ledgers to verify his calculations against the documented property values. Lawrence provided the books willingly, even proudly. His father's record-keeping was legendary in the county, and Lawrence had maintained the same standards. He showed Pritchard to the study, a wood-paneled room lined with shelves containing decades of ledgers, journals, and correspondence. The documents were organized chronologically, each spine labeled with dates in neat script. Lawrence left Pritchard to work, returning to his own duties, confident that the assessment would confirm Strathmore's standing as a well-managed property. Pritchard began with the current year's ledger, working backward to establish patterns of productivity and property accumulation. The entries were indeed impressive in their detail. Every bushel of tobacco, every pound of pork, every birth and death among the enslaved population, all recorded with precision. He made notes, calculated values, cross-referenced figures. Standard work, though unusually pleasant given the quality of the documentation. It was while examining the birth records that Pritchard first noticed something unusual. The enslaved population showed consistent growth through natural increase, which was common enough, but one woman's name appeared with striking frequency. Harriet, no surname, born 1808, listed as house servant. Between 1822 and 1845, she had given birth to 12 children, an extraordinarily high number even by plantation standards, where enslaved women were often forced into continuous childbearing. What caught Pritchard's attention more than the number was the notation pattern. Most births in the ledger included some indication of parentage, useful for tracking bloodlines and preventing inbreeding, which planters feared would diminish property values. But Harriet's earlier children, Ruth, Sarah, Mary, Thomas, had no father listed, just blank spaces where names should appear. Then, starting in 1835, the pattern changed. 5 consecutive births listed Father Lawrence Strathmore, in the same hand that made the other entries. Pritchard paused, pen hovering over his notes. The explicit acknowledgement of parentage by the plantation owner was unusual, not unheard of. Some planters did acknowledge their children by enslaved women, occasionally even freeing them, but the systematic documentation suggested something beyond isolated incidents. He flipped back through earlier volumes, tracing Harriet's entries backward. The 1821-1830 ledger was in different handwriting, Edmund Strathmore's based on the signature on the inside cover. Here, Pritchard found more entries for Harriet's children, the earliest dated January 1822, when Harriet would have been 14. Harriet delivered of a daughter, healthy, light-skinned, named Ruth, to be raised in the house. Still no father listed. 3 more births through 1828, same pattern. Detailed entries about the children, deliberate omissions about paternity. A suspicion was forming in Pritchard's mind, disturbing enough that he tried to dismiss it as uncharitable assumption. Perhaps the fathers were unknown, different enslaved men whose names weren't recorded because they didn't affect property lineage. Perhaps Harriet had been hired out to neighboring plantations and returned pregnant. There were innocent explanations, and Pritchard, by nature and profession, preferred documented facts to speculation. But then he found Edmund Strathmore's private journals shelved separately from the business ledgers. These were personal records, not meant for county clerks or outside examination. Lawrence had apparently included them without reviewing their contents, assuming they were simply more plantation records of the type his father kept. Pritchard opened the first journal dated 1820-1825. The entries mixed plantation business with personal reflections, observations about tobacco cultivation alongside notes about the weather, local politics, social visits, and scattered through these pages in the same measured hand that recorded crop yields were entries about Harriet. January 1822. Harriet has proven adaptable to household duties. She shows intelligence beyond her station and has learned tasks quickly. Catherine's death leaves the household without proper female management, and the girl's assistance becomes increasingly valuable. The entry was mundane, employer assessing servant. But then, several pages later, March 1822, the situation with Harriet has developed beyond initial intentions. I have allowed myself liberties that, while legally permissible, trouble my conscience when contemplated in daylight hours. Yet the practicalities of plantation management require certain accommodations. Pritchard felt his stomach tighten. The language was cautious, coded, but the meaning was clear. He continued reading, finding more such entries. Edmund Strathmore had documented not just the children born, but his own actions leading to their conception. The journal became a chronicle of ongoing exploitation described in terms that mixed self-justification with occasional glimpses of guilt, quickly rationalized away. June 1824. Sarah born to Harriet. The child appears healthy and will prove valuable in time. I tell myself this arrangement serves multiple purposes. Domestic tranquility in the absence of a wife and natural increase to the property holdings. Other men maintain such arrangements openly. I merely do so with greater discretion. The reasoning was circular, defensive, a man arguing with himself and losing. By the time Pritchard reached Edmund's entries from the early 1830s, the tone had shifted from justification to something more calculated. October 1834. Lawrence returns from college next month. At 21, he must begin understanding all aspects of plantation management. The boy has led a sheltered life, influenced too much by his mother's relatives and their sentimental views. He must learn that effective management sometimes requires decisions that seem harsh to outsiders, but are necessary for maintaining order and productivity. I have determined to educate him in practical matters, including those arrangements which, while not discussed in polite company, form part of the plantation economy. Pritchard set down the journal and walked to the window, needing to clear his head. Outside, enslaved people moved through their evening routines, carrying water, tending fires, completing tasks before darkness fell completely. The scene appeared ordinary, the kind of plantation tableau visible across Virginia. But the documents in this room revealed something underneath that ordinary surface. A system of exploitation so thoroughly normalized that it could be recorded in the same ledgers that tracked tobacco yields, described with the same clinical language applied to livestock breeding. He returned to the desk and continued reading, compelled now by a need to understand the full scope of what Edmund had documented. The entries from 1835-1840 showed Edmund deliberately involving Lawrence in plantation management, including what he called household arrangements. There were no explicit descriptions, but the progression was clear. Edmund introducing his son to practices he himself had established, treating Harriet's systematic abuse as part of Lawrence's education in being a master. March 1835. Lawrence has begun to understand the full range of his authority and responsibilities. He shows initial reluctance influenced by romantic notions picked up at college, but I observe this fading as practical experience replaces abstract ideals. The boy will make a proper planter. The pride in Edmund's words was chilling. Pride not just in his son's development, but in the specific understanding being passed down. The journal documented Lawrence's first child with Harriet, born later that same year. Edmund's entry noted it almost casually. Harriet delivered of a son, Marcus, acknowledged as Lawrence's. The pattern continues to the next generation, as I intended. This systematic approach to natural increase combined with careful record-keeping represents a model that other plantations might benefit from studying, though the topic remains unsuitable for public discussion. Pritchard realized he was reading a confession, not framed as such, not written with any sense of wrongdoing, but a confession nonetheless. Edmund Strathmore had not stumbled into exploiting Harriet. He had planned it, continued it across decades, and deliberately passed the practice to his son. The documentation wasn't incidental. It was part of the system itself, a record of what Edmund apparently viewed as innovative plantation management. The later journals, now in Lawrence's hand, continued the pattern. His entries lacked his father's philosophical meanderings, being more purely transactional, but they confirmed the continuation of everything Edmund had established. Births were recorded, the children's development noted in terms of their future labor value, and the entire arrangement treated as simply one more aspect of property management. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in these records intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Pritchard found himself reading faster now, driven by a compulsion to reach the end, to see if there was any recognition of wrongdoing, any moment where either man acknowledged the humanity they were systematically violating. But there was nothing. The journals ended in early 1847 with Lawrence's entries noting Harriet's declining health in the same tone one might describe a workhorse going lame. Regrettable from a property standpoint, but not a moral crisis. It was approaching midnight when Pritchard finally closed the last journal. He sat in silence for long minutes trying to organize his thoughts. What he had read was legally permissible. Virginia law granted enslavers complete authority over enslaved people, including rights that extended to sexual access. Courts had consistently ruled that enslaved people could not testify against white people, could not refuse orders, had no right to bodily autonomy. Everything Edmund and Lawrence had done was protected by law. But the systematic nature of it, the documentation, the deliberate generational continuity, this felt different. This wasn't casual exploitation, but planned abuse recorded with the pride of innovation. And the records themselves were now in Pritchard's hands, having been offered to him as routine business documentation. What was his obligation? What was his authority? What would even constitute appropriate action in the face of legally protected horror? He spent a troubled night in the Strathmore guest room, sleep broken by fragments of what he'd read. The next morning he requested additional documents from Lawrence, needing to complete his assessment, but also wanting to verify what he'd discovered. Lawrence provided everything requested, still showing no awareness of what the records revealed. To him they were simply thorough bookkeeping, the kind his father had taught him to maintain. Pritchard spent the entire second day cross-referencing the journals against the property ledgers, building a complete timeline. The documentation was indeed comprehensive. He could trace not just Harriet's children, but their assignments to various tasks as they aged, their valuations for insurance purposes, their roles in the plantation economy. Ruth, the eldest, was valued at $800 by age 18, listed as an experienced house servant. The younger children had increasing values as they approached working age. The entire family, created through systematic rape across 2 generations, was calculated as part of the plantation's worth. He also found correspondence between Edmund and other planters, discussing natural increase as an investment strategy. A letter from 1837 filed with business papers included Edmund's advice to a neighboring plantation owner. The key is systematic attention to the matter, treating it as one would any breeding program with careful selection and consistent application. Documentation proves essential both for insurance purposes and for tracking improvements in stock quality. The language made Pritchard physically ill. Breeding program stock quality terms applied to human beings. On the third day, Pritchard informed Lawrence that he needed to return to Byton to complete his assessment report, but would file additional documentation regarding unusual circumstances requiring commissioner review. Lawrence seemed puzzled but not alarmed. He assumed this was some technical requirement related to property valuation complexity. He offered Pritchard use of a horse and thanked him for his thoroughness. The ride back to Byton gave Pritchard time to think. He carried in his satchel not just his assessment forms, but pages of notes documenting what he'd found, along with dates and ledger references to support his report. But what exactly would he report? That a planter had documented doing what countless other planters did without documentation? That enslavement included sexual exploitation? A fact everyone already knew, but nobody discussed that the legal system explicitly permitted what moral sensibility condemned. He drafted his report that evening in his Boyden office, writing and rewriting, trying to find language that would convey the situation's gravity without seeming hysterical or overstepping his authority. The final version included his standard property assessment. Fields, buildings, enslaved people, equipment, all valued according to standard formulas. But attached was a separate document marked Private Concerns requiring commissioner attention. In this attachment, Pritchard detailed what he'd found. The systematic pattern spanning 27 years, the documentation of deliberate generational continuation, the explicit acknowledgement in the journals of treating Harriet as property to be exploited across decades. He carefully cited ledger pages and dates, providing evidence for every claim. His conclusion was carefully worded. The records indicate practices that, while legally permissible, raise questions regarding estate settlement complications, potential disputes over property status of certain individuals, and documentation that might prove problematic should legal frameworks regarding slavery undergo future modification. The language was deliberately bureaucratic, framing moral horror as administrative complexity. Pritchard knew he couldn't challenge slavery itself. His position didn't permit such scope, and Virginia society wouldn't tolerate it. But perhaps he could create a record that might matter later. Documentation that proved someone had noticed, had objected, had tried to make the truth official, even if no action followed. He submitted the report to Commissioner Josiah Hicks on October 18, 1847. Hicks read it in Pritchard's presence, his expression growing darker as he progressed through the attachment. When he finished, he sat in silence for nearly a minute before speaking. "This is detailed," Hicks finally said. "You're certain of these facts. Everything is documented in the Strathmore ledgers," Pritchard replied. "The journals are explicit." Edmund Strathmore described his actions and intentions clearly, and Lawrence continued the pattern. Hicks shuffled the papers uncomfortably. "You understand this present's difficulties. The Strathmores are an established family. What you describe, while disturbing, isn't illegal. Many plantations involve similar situations, though most have the discretion not to document them so thoroughly." "That's precisely my point, Commissioner. The documentation exists. Should these records ever become relevant to legal proceedings, estate disputes, property settlements, future changes in legal status, they could complicate matters significantly, and you believe such complications are likely." Pritchard chose his words carefully. "I believe thorough documentation sometimes reveals things that remain invisible when undocumented. Whether that documentation should be ignored or addressed isn't my decision to make, but as county clear, I cannot complete a property assessment and simply file away records that explicitly describe systematic." He paused, searching for acceptable language, exploitation of property in ways that blur legal categories. Hicks understood the coded language. Pritchard was saying the records revealed Harriet's children were simultaneously property and family, enslaved and blood relatives, their status ambiguous in ways that could create legal tangles. He was also saying something remained deeply wrong, even if the law permitted it. "What are you requesting I do?" Hicks asked. "Investigate, interview the parties involved, create an official record of findings. At minimum, document that county authorities were aware of the situation should questions arise later." Hicks considered this. The request was reasonable from a procedural standpoint, even if motivated by moral concerns. But investigating the Strathmore plantation meant potentially exposing practices that occurred throughout the county. It meant forcing planters to confront officially what they preferred to ignore publicly. It meant risking social and political backlash from the very class that controlled county government. "I'll need time to consider how to proceed," Hendricks said finally. "Leave the documents with me. I'll review them thoroughly and determine what, if any, action is appropriate." Pritchard left the commissioner's office knowing that time to consider likely meant time to find a way to bury this. But he'd done what he could within his authority. The documentation now existed in official county records filed with a government office available to anyone who might someday look for it. Over the following days, Pritchard waited for some response from Hicks. None came. He made discreet inquiries and learned the commissioner had consulted with the county attorney, who advised that no legal violations had occurred and therefore no investigation was warranted. The Strathmore records were filed as part of the routine tax assessment. The attachment marked "reviewed," no action required. A week after his initial report, Pritchard received a summons to Hendricks's office. He arrived to find not just the commissioner, but also Lawrence Strathmore and the county attorney, Benjamin Hayes. The atmosphere was tense. "Mr. Pritchard," Hayes began formally, "we've reviewed your report regarding the Strathmore property assessment. While we appreciate your thoroughness, there are concerns about your interpretation of standard plantation records and your characterization of legally sanctioned property management as somehow problematic." Pritchard felt his anger rising, but kept his voice level. "I characterized nothing. I documented what the records themselves state explicitly." "You documented your interpretation," Hayes interrupted. "You've taken standard business records and framed them in language suggesting impropriety where none exists legally. This constitutes overreach of your authority as an assessor." Lawrence Strathmore spoke for the first time, his voice carrying genuine confusion rather than anger. "Mr. Pritchard, I don't understand your objection. The records my father kept and I maintain document property management. They're unusually detailed, certainly, but that's a virtue, not a fault. What precisely do you claim I've done wrong?" The question hung in the air. Pritchard realized Lawrence truly didn't understand. He'd been raised in a system that normalized absolute power over enslaved people, educated by a father who treated systematic sexual exploitation as property management, surrounded by a society that legally and socially sanctioned such practices. To Lawrence, Harriet was property, Her children were property. Using them as he saw fit was simply exercising ownership rights, no different than working them in fields or assigning them household duties. You've treated a human being as an object for 3 decades, Pritchard said quietly. You and your father documented systematic rape as if recording crop yields. You passed this practice between generations like inheriting land, and you did all this with such confidence in its acceptability that you openly recorded it. Rape? Lawrence's confusion deepened. That term applies to crimes against persons. Enslaved people are property under Virginia law. By definition, what you describe cannot occur between master and property. You're applying incorrect legal terminology to standard plantation practices. And there it was. The logic of slavery stated plainly. Lawrence was legally correct. Virginia law defined enslaved people as property, not persons. Rape statutes protected white women but didn't recognize enslaved women as victims capable of being raped. Sexual access to enslaved people was considered a property right. Lawrence hadn't committed any crime recognized by the state. The law is wrong, Pritchard said, knowing even as he spoke that he was ending his career. Hayes's expression hardened. That's a political opinion, Mr. Pritchard, not a legal assessment. As county clerk, your role is to document property values according to existing law, not to critique the legal framework itself. Your report characterizes lawful conduct as criminal, uses inflammatory language about respected citizens, and attempts to create official documentation of objections that have no basis in statute or regulation. I documented facts stated in the Strathmore records themselves. You documented selective facts arranged to support a political argument against slavery. This county, this state, and this nation have determined that slavery is lawful. Your personal objections don't grant you authority to use official reports to argue otherwise. The meeting concluded with Hicks requiring Pritchard to submit a revised report containing only standard property valuations without editorial commentary. Pritchard refused. He was given a choice: submit a proper report or resign his position. He resigned that afternoon, November 2, 1847. His final act as county clearer was to prepare a comprehensive summary of the Strathmore documents, including extensive quotes from Edmund's journals and detailed chronologies of Harriet's documented exploitation. He submitted this to the county record office as supplementary documentation for the Strathmore property file, where it would remain unless specifically removed by officials. The clearer who received it, a young man named Thomas Wickham, read it with obvious discomfort, but filed it as submitted. What you're describing happened, Wickham asked quietly. It's all documented in their own records, Pritchard replied. Whether anyone will care is another question. He left Bedon the following week, relocating to Richmond, where he found work with a shipping company far from the plantation economy that had cost him his career for objecting to legally sanctioned horror. The aftermath of Pritchard's departure played out over the following months with a silence that was itself revealing. Commissioner Hicks filed Pritchard's supplementary documentation, but made no public statement about its contents. The county attorney, Benjamin Hayes, advised the commissioners that the matter was concluded. No legal violations had occurred. An overzealous clerk had been dealt with appropriately, and no further action was warranted or desirable. Lawrence Strathmore returned to his plantation, apparently satisfied that he'd been vindicated. From his perspective, the entire episode had been an unfortunate encounter with someone who held radical views about slavery. Nothing more. His ledgers continued in the same meticulous style, though notably the private journals ceased. Whether this reflected increased discretion after the scrutiny or simply a preference for recording only business matters is unclear, but the confrontation had consequences that rippled beyond the official silence. Word spread through the county's network of planters, merchants, and officials, not about the specific details, which remained undiscussed, but about the general fact that Pritchard had objected to something in the Strathmore records, something related to enslaved people and family relationships. In a society built on unspoken agreements about what would and wouldn't be openly acknowledged, the breach of this silence created discomfort. Martha Strathmore, Thomas's wife, learned details of the incident through her husband. Her letters from December 1847 show a woman grappling with knowledge she could neither act upon nor ignore. I have always known things occurred that troubled my conscience, she wrote to her sister in Petersburg, but I believed my awareness remained private, my discomfort my own burden. Now I learn others have seen what I saw, have documented what I chose to look away from, and have been punished for refusing to maintain our collective pretense. What does this make me? What does this make all of us? The letter went unanswered. Her sister burned it unread, later explaining she couldn't bear to read complaints about matters none of us have power to change. This response was typical of the planter class's approach to uncomfortable truths. Avoidance, silence, and insistence on individual powerlessness that excused collective complicity. Harriet's health, already fragile through the fall of 1847, deteriorated further as winter approached. The physical toll of 27 years of continuous pregnancy and childbearing combined with the stresses of enslaved domestic labor had worn her body beyond recovery. Martha continued to provide what care she could. Herbal remedies, broths, occasionally laudanum for pain, but no one suggested seeking a doctor. Medical care for enslaved people was typically reserved for situations where property value needed protecting, and at 40 years old, having borne 12 children, Harriet represented declining rather than appreciating property. The younger children, those still living in the main house or nearby, attended to their mother as circumstances allowed. Ruth, now 25, and herself a mother, spent what time she could spare from her own duties sitting with Harriet. The other enslaved people on the plantation, bound by the networks of care and kinship that sustained survival within slavery, also provided support when possible. Food was shared, tasks redistributed, small mercies offered within the narrow margins that enslavement permitted. Harriet died on January 14, 1848, 3 months after Samuel Pritchard's visit. The cause listed in plantation records was simply illness. No details, no specifics, no autopsy or diagnosis. Her death was recorded in the same ledger column where her children's births had been documented. Another transaction in the endless accounting of plantation property valued at $100 in the estate records, a significant decline from the $600 she'd been worth at age 20. She was listed among the year's property losses along with a broken plow and a horse that had died of colics. Martha Strathmore insisted on a proper burial over Lawrence's indifference. A plot was marked in the enslaved people's cemetery, a rough clearing beyond the plantation's main grounds where wooden markers deteriorated in Virginia weather. Martha arranged for a Methodist preacher to conduct a brief service attended by the enslaved community and unusually by Martha herself. No Strathmore men attended. Lawrence was in Boyden on business and Thomas pleaded illness. Their absence was noticed and noted in the quiet ways that enslaved people marked the moral failures of those who claimed authority over them. The preacher, Reverend Nathan Cooper, had visited Strathmore before and knew the community. His brief sermon carefully avoided specific references to Harriet's life, but his text was pointed from Exodus about the Hebrew midwives who defied Pharaoh, choosing righteousness over obedience to evil. "God sees what occurs in darkness," he said, his voice carrying across the gathered Moors. "God knows what the powerful choose not to acknowledge, and God remembers those who suffered without earthly justice." The words were careful enough to avoid giving offense to any white person who might hear them, but clear enough that everyone present understood their meaning. After Harriet's burial, life on the Strathmore plantation continued its rhythms. Crops were planted and harvested, children were born and occasionally died. Enslaved people were bought and sold as economic needs dictated. Harriet's children remained on the property, their status unchanged by their mother's death. Ruth continued as a house servant. Marcus, now 13, worked in the fields, his earlier escape attempt neither forgotten nor explicitly referenced. The younger children grew into their roles within the plantation economy, some showing abilities that made them valuable, others deemed suitable only for basic labor. Lawrence's separated wife, Elizabeth, never returned to the plantation. She remained with her family in Halifax County, raising their son Edmund in an environment deliberately distanced from Strathmore. The boy grew up knowing he had a father and an inheritance awaiting him. But Elizabeth shaped his understanding to emphasize responsibilities over privileges. Letters between Elizabeth and her sister, preserved in family papers, reveal her determination that Edmund would be raised with different values than those that had governed Strathmore. "I cannot prevent him from inheriting that place," Elizabeth wrote in 1849. "But I can ensure he inherits it as a man who understands the difference between legal authority and moral legitimacy. He will know that power over others is not licensed to abuse them, that property rights do not trump human dignity, and that our family's wealth was built on suffering. We have a duty to acknowledge, if not repair." Whether Elizabeth succeeded in this education remains unclear from the historical record. Edmund grew to adulthood, knowing his father only through occasional visits and letters. His understanding of Strathmore filtered through his mother's careful framing. The split between his parents was never formalized. Divorce was difficult and scandalous, but their de facto separation was permanent. The Strathmore property itself evolved through the 1850s as Virginia's agricultural economy shifted. Tobacco prices remained volatile, and Lawrence diversified into wheat and corn. Following the pattern of many Mecklenburg planters, the enslaved population grew through natural increase. Harriet's children, as they reached adulthood, had children of their own, adding to the plantation's labor force. Ruth married a man from a neighboring plantation, and Lawrence allowed the relationship because it kept her productive, and the children would be his property. The Strathmore case remained buried in county records throughout these years, the documents Samuel Pritchard had filed, gathering dust in storage. Occasionally, someone conducting a state research or title examination would encounter the records and read Pritchard's report with varying degrees of discomfort, but no action ever resulted. The system protected itself through layers of official procedure and informal understanding. Everyone who might object lacked authority to act, and everyone with authority chose not to see. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 disrupted plantation operations across Virginia. Lawrence, now 53, was too old for combat service, but he contributed money and supplies to the Confederate cause. The plantation supplied food to military units and occasionally housed wounded soldiers. The enslaved population, aware that the war's outcome might affect their status, waited and watched and made careful calculations about loyalty and survival. Lawrence died in October 1863, aged 55, from pneumonia complications. His death came just months after the Emancipation Proclamation, though actual freedom for Strathmore's enslaved people remained uncertain given Virginia's position as a Confederate state. Lawrence's will divided the property between his separated wife, Elizabeth, and their son, Edmund, now 20 years old. The document made no specific provisions for Harriet's children, who were still legally enslaved despite Union proclamations that might eventually be enforced. The end of the war in 1865 and the gradual implementation of emancipation finally freed all enslaved people on the Strathmore plantation. The transition was chaotic. Legal freedom didn't automatically provide land, money, or security. Some of Harriet's surviving children left immediately, heading north or to cities where they might establish new lives with some protection from their previous masters. Others remained in the area temporarily, lacking resources to move and hoping to earn wages from their former enslavers while planning eventual departure. Ruth, the eldest, was 43 at emancipation. She had spent her entire life in slavery, bearing children who themselves had been enslaved. The records don't clearly document what happened to her after 1865, though one reference in Freedmen's Bureau records from 1867 mentions a Ruth Strathmore requesting assistance to relocate to Washington, D.C. Whether this was Harriet's daughter or another woman with the same name is unclear. Marcus, who had attempted escape as a boy, left Mecklenburg County within weeks of emancipation. No records trace his subsequent path, though some evidence suggests he may have changed his name and moved west, deliberately severing all connections to his Virginia origins. For many formerly enslaved people, especially those of mixed ancestry, whose very existence testified to slavery's sexual exploitation, starting completely fresh meant abandoning even their names. The younger children scattered similarly, their fates lost to historical documentation. The chaos of Reconstruction, the deliberate destruction of Freedmen's Bureau records by white Southerners, and the general lack of interest in tracking formerly enslaved people's lives all contributed to the erasure of their stories. They survived slavery, gained legal freedom, and then disappeared into the gaps of historical record. Their endings unknown, their voices unpreserved. Young Edmund Strathmore, raised by his mother with awareness of his family's moral failures, took control of the plantation in 1865. At age 22, he confronted a property in economic collapse. Emancipation had eliminated his labor force without compensation. War had destroyed markets and infrastructure, and the plantation's value had plummeted. Whether motivated by his mother's teachings or simple economic pragmatism, Edmund decided not to continue plantation operations. He sold the property in 1867 to a land speculator, receiving far less than pre-war value, but enough to establish himself in Richmond. In Richmond, Edmund worked in banking and insurance, building a new career deliberately disconnected from plantation agriculture. He married in 1870, had 3 children, and by all appearances integrated himself into Richmond's professional class. He never returned to Mecklenburg County after the sale, and his letters to his mother contain no references to Strathmore or its history. Whether this silence reflected shame, indifference, or deliberate forgetting is impossible to determine. The Strathmore plantation property passed through several owners in the late 19th century. Without enslaved labor and facing agricultural market instability, it proved difficult to operate profitably. The main house fell into disrepair, eventually being torn down in the 1890s. The land was subdivided and sold piecemeal, some portions reverting to forest, others incorporated into smaller farms. The physical landscape that had contained Harriet's life gradually erased, leaving only scattered foundations and overgrown cemetery plots as evidence that a plantation once occupied the site. The county records remained, however. The ledgers, journals, and Samuel Pritchard's report stayed in storage through the Reconstruction years and into the late 19th century. No one examined them systematically until 1891, when a property dispute among Edmund Strathmore's descendants required review of the original estate documents. A lawyer named Jacob Morrison, tasked with establishing clear title to some remaining Strathmore holdings, discovered Pritchard's report while researching the property history. Morrison was 53, a Virginia native who had fought for the Confederacy and built a successful law practice after the war. He approached the documents expecting routine property records and instead found himself reading Edmund Strathmore's explicit journals and Pritchard's meticulous documentation of what they contained. Morrison later described the experience in a letter to a colleague. "I have practiced law for 25 years, handled innumerable estate matters involving enslaved people as property, and considered myself unsentimental about the institution we lost. But reading these records, seeing the systematic nature documented across generations, the clinical precision with which one family recorded continuous sexual exploitation, I found myself physically sickened in a way. Abstract discussions of slavery never affected me." Morrison's reaction revealed something significant about historical memory in the post-Reconstruction South. By 1891, the lost cause mythology had taken firm hold. Southern whites increasingly described slavery as benevolent, enslaved people as contented, and the antebellum period as a golden age destroyed by Northern aggression. This narrative required forgetting or minimizing slavery's actual nature. Morrison's encounter with the Strathmore records forced him to confront documentation that contradicted the comforting myth, evidence that slavery enabled systematic cruelty recorded with pride by the perpetrators. He brought the records to the attention of the Virginia Historical Society, believing they should be preserved as evidence of slavery's true nature. But the timing was poor. The 1890s marked the height of Southern white backlash against Reconstruction, the period when Jim Crow laws were being enacted, black voting rights systematically eliminated, and white supremacy reasserted through legal and extra-legal violence. The Historical Society declined to acquire the Strathmore records, with one board member explaining in private correspondence that such materials serve only to inflame sectional tensions we must heal and to present our region's history in unnecessarily harsh light. Morrison eventually donated the records to the Mecklenburg County Historical Society, where they were filed and largely forgotten. No publication resulted, no historical study, no public acknowledgement. The documents existed, available to anyone who specifically sought them, but effectively invisible to public consciousness. A few local historians examined them over subsequent decades, usually expressing shock at their contents, but none pursued publication or broader dissemination. The Strathmore case remained what it had always been, a truth known to specific individuals but never acknowledged officially or publicly. The 20th century brought new waves of historical scholarship that gradually changed approaches to studying slavery. Early academic work tended to focus on economic and political aspects, treating slavery primarily as a labor system and political conflict. But by mid-century, historians increasingly examined slavery's human dimensions, incorporating enslaved people's experiences and perspectives. This shift created context where the Strathmore record's significance could be recognized. In 1953, a graduate student at the University of Virginia named Margaret Thornton, researching Virginia plantation records for her dissertation, discovered the Strathmore documents at the Mecklenburg County Historical Society. Thornton was studying enslaved women's experiences, and the systematic documentation immediately struck her as extraordinary. Most evidence of sexual exploitation and slavery came from indirect sources, occasional court cases, passing references in letters, oral histories collected after emancipation. The Strathmore records provided something almost unique: explicit detailed documentation by the perpetrators themselves, maintained over decades with clinical precision. Thornton's dissertation, completed in 1955, included extensive analysis of the Strathmore case as an example of slavery's sexual exploitation, made visible through exceptional documentation. She traced the full chronology from Edmund's first entries through Harriet's death and the children's fates after emancipation. Her work provided the first scholarly examination of the case, placing it within broader patterns of enslaved women's experiences while noting its unusual documentation. The dissertation attracted attention from other scholars researching slavery, and excerpts were published in academic journals in the late 1950s and early 1960s. But broader public awareness remained limited. Academic historical work in this period reached relatively narrow audiences, and discussions of slavery's sexual dimensions remained controversial, even in scholarly contexts. Many white Southerners still resisted any examination of slavery that challenged lost cause mythology. While discussions of sexual violence remained generally taboo in public discourse, the civil rights movement of the 1960s gradually created space for more honest discussion of slavery's realities, as Black Americans fought for basic rights and white supremacist violence was broadcast on national television. The mythology of benevolent slavery became harder to maintain. Historical scholarship increasingly emphasized slavery's brutality, drawing on evidence like the Strathmore records to counter romanticized narratives. By the 1970s, the Strathmore case had become somewhat better known among historians studying slavery, cited in various books and articles examining enslaved women's experiences, but public awareness remained minimal. The records themselves stayed in Mecklenburg County, examined by occasional researchers, but never widely disseminated or publicly exhibited. Harriet's story remained primarily an academic reference, known to specialists, but absent from popular understanding of slavery's history. This mirrors the broader pattern of how slavery's sexual exploitation has been remembered. Widely known in general terms, but rarely documented in specifics, discussed in abstract but not in the detailed reality that would force genuine confrontation with what the system enabled. The Strathmore records exist as an exception to this pattern, unusually explicit, systematically documented, preserved, despite efforts at burial. Yet, even with this documentation, the story remained marginal to public historical consciousness. The descendants of Harriet's children, scattered across the country through multiple generations of migration and name changes, likely know nothing of her story or their origins. The deliberate eraser that began with Edmund's omission of paternity in early ledgers continued through the chaos of emancipation, the destruction of Freedmen's Bureau records, and the general lack of genealogical documentation for African Americans in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Family lines were broken, names were changed, and connections to Virginia origins were deliberately or accidentally severed. The Strathmore property today is partially occupied by a small residential development built in the 1980s. The remaining land reverting to second-growth forest. No historical marker notes what occurred there. The Virginia Civil War Trails program, which has installed hundreds of markers across the state, has not erected one at the Strathmore site, and local tourism materials make no reference to the plantation's history. The land itself reveals nothing of the documented horrors that occurred there across the antebellum decades. The foundation of the main house remains partially visible to those who know where to look, slowly being consumed by vegetation and erosion. Archaeologists have not excavated the site. No compelling reason has emerged to justify the expense, and local resistance to examining slavery's specific realities would likely complicate such work. The enslaved people's cemetery, where Harriet was buried in 1848, has been lost entirely. No maintained markers remain. No clear boundaries define the space, and development has likely disturbed or destroyed whatever graves once existed there. This physical eraser parallels the historical eraser that the Strathmore case both documents and exemplifies. The records preserved evidence of systematic sexual exploitation across generations, carefully documented by perpetrators, confident in the legitimacy of their actions. Yet even with this extraordinary documentation, the story remains marginal, known to specialists, occasionally cited in academic work, but absent from public memory and physical commemoration. This mystery shows us that truth requires more than documentation. It requires public willingness to acknowledge what the documentation reveals. The Strathmore records existed in county archives for decades before anyone examined them critically. They then existed in academic scholarship for decades more before reaching wider awareness. Even now, most Americans remain unaware of this specific case or what it represents about slavery's systematic sexual violence. What do you think of this story? Does knowing such systematic exploitation was not just permitted but documented with pride change how we understand slavery's true nature? Does the preservation of these records create any obligation for descendants, both black descendants of enslaved people and white descendants of enslavers, to acknowledge and address this history? Leave your comment below with your thoughts. If you found this historical account important and want to hear more stories that reveal difficult truths from America's past, please subscribe to the Liturgy of Fear, hit the notification bell, and share this video with others who believe we must confront history honestly, no matter how disturbing the truth. These stories matter because forgetting them allows us to believe such things could never happen when the evidence shows they did systematically, deliberately, and with full legal protection. The Strathmore case isn't exceptional because of what occurred, but because someone documented it so thoroughly. How many other stories remain untold because no one preserved the evidence? See you in the next video.